At the end of the last episode of this Duetto Spider project, I had wrapped up a rebuild of the steering box, and in the episode before that, I had rebuilt the clutch system, and spent time going over the engine and gearbox. Now, it's finally time to put it all together. I'm determined to hear this engine run before this episode is over. Before I can put this engine and gearbox back in for good, there are a few jobs around the engine bay that need doing. The most obvious one is the rebuilt steering box needs to be installed. But first, I need to clean up the wiring. This car has quite a bit of excess wiring in the engine bay and under the dashboard. Once that's cleaned up, I need to test it to make sure everything still works. There is definitely some shenanigans going on with the indicator circuit, but amazingly they work, so I'll let that sleeping dog lie. The steering box needs a new ground wire for the horn system. This runs through the length of the steering column and up to the horn ring on the steering wheel. It's easiest to fit this on the bench rather than in the car. The steering box itself bolts up to the chassis with 3 bolts, but they also hold on the steering limiters in the wheel arch. These are important as they prevent the steering system from overextending itself. Without these limiters, the only thing stopping the steering movement would be the internals of the steering box coming into contact with the aluminium housing, which will of course crack with the force. I've heard of 105s splitting their steering boxes while at full lock, usually while parking. That's probably because these limiters weren't adjusted properly or were missing altogether. Now with the box in place, I can fill it with oil and connect the wire to the rest of the loom. The column bracket and the light switch can go back on now too. Alfa 105s have a key to keep the steering wheel in place, not splines. It's a bit of a fiddle to pin this key into place while you fit the wheel. There's a spring under that shroud that needs to be pushed back to expose the keyway in the column. You just need things to line up for a second and the wheel will slot into place. Then the nut can be tightened up and the horn wire connected on this end. And that job is done. Something that I noticed in the engine bay was that the throttle lever needed attention. The rubber bush which holds the connecting ball joint for the throttle rod has disintegrated. I think this will make throttle control a bit sloppy, so it needs to be replaced. I don't have a replacement rubber bush, so I'm going to make one out of brass. It won't isolate the pedal from vibrations as well as rubber, but it will be very accurate and it won't wear with time. This bushing is the exact same dimensions as the bushing I made for the clutch pivoting arm, and the factory used the same rubber bush for both. Classic Alfa stocks a replacement bush that will do this job, but I'm happy with brass as a long-lasting solution, even if it isn't as smooth. Here I must make a full disclosure. I had taken some time to do a rust repair job on this car. The owner wanted a sump guard fitted, which is a great idea for South African driving conditions, but I discovered that the radiator crossmember was rotten on the underside, right where the guard would bolt on. I didn't film the repair process because it's very boring and unpleasant and I wanted it over and done with as soon as possible. But here's the section I removed, and now this guard fits great. Moving on. Before I refit the engine, I need to install the front anti-roll bar. Having a sump guard installed means it's far easier to do this now, before fitting the engine. I'm taking this opportunity to change the anti-roll bar bushes and the drop links. The drop links on these early pre-1968 cars are different side to side, and this car had 2 matching drop links. So, best to get a new set. Alongside the new drop links themselves, I have some new bushes to connect them to the spring pans. Now it's time for the main event. The engine and gearbox have received a lot of attention over the last few weeks. Now it's time for them to go back into the car for good. I like to install engines and gearboxes as a unit, with the front half of the prop shaft in place. I find it's too easy to damage the clutch friction disc while wrestling the gearbox in from under the car. Getting the input shaft into the clutch disc isn't that easy even when I have the engine out of the car, so if I can avoid putting the engine gearbox in individually, I will be happier. I also find fitting the rubber prop shaft coupling really challenging when it's in place, so I get it all installed beforehand. I like to keep the carburetors and the exhaust manifolds on as well, but I remove the exhaust side engine mount and fit that at the last moment, right before the engine is in place. This gearbox has been leaking oil out the speedometer drive even while just sitting in the workshop, so that needs a new seal. There was a piece of foam shoved in here. It's not going to do anything to keep that oil from leaking out. On these speedo drives you can fit a new seal on top of the old seal and it will hold. These are the little things that make the difference between a car that drops oil and one that doesn't. And I sure hope this one doesn't. I'll remove the gear selector from the top of the gearbox. This helps the gearbox clear the transmission tunnel without catching, and all this can be easily installed from inside the car later on. It's best to get the nose of the car as low as possible with the tail high. This gives the best access to the transmission tunnel. I keep the front jacking points on the pads of my lift, and I put jack stands under the rear axle and lower it. It's a bit tough to guide the engine and work the crane at the same time, but I've gotten used to doing these 105 engine installs on my own over the years. The trick is to get the whole thing as vertical as you can. So vertical that gearbox oil spills out and makes a huge mess. Then get the tail of the gearbox between the main crossmember and the firewall, without letting the sump land on top of the radiator top crossmember. Once it's clear, put a jack under the gearbox and guide it into the right position. And fit the engine mounts. It's quite simple, and with a bit of practice, it can be done in just a few minutes, even on your own. A job that seems really small and easy is connecting the hand throttle and choke cables, but on an Alfa 105, it's actually a massive pain. I had some new cables made up as this car didn't have any when it came in, but getting them from the lever under the dashboard to the correct points in the firewall is a huge fiddle. And connecting the choke cable to the levers on the carburetors is no easy task either. It's best to get these little bolts and nuts into great shape before trying to do them up. They're hard enough to install without blunt threads. This is my special bent 7mm spanner made for tightening up these bolts. Okay, tangent over. Although the engine is in place, I won't be happy with this episode until I hear it run. And there are so many little jobs around the engine bay that need doing before that. I've spent some time tidying up and rewrapping the wiring loom, and I've fitted the alternator and rev counter cable. I need to install the fan, and before I can do that, I need to connect the coolant return line to the water pump. This is the outlet for the coolant coming from the heater unit. If you want to see more about the heater in this car, I did a video about it a couple episodes back. Now I can install the fan. The front of this engine can become very, very crowded. It becomes quite difficult to reach things like the rev counter cable and the water pump once the alternator, fan, and fan belt are installed. There was some bypass wiring here for a missing horn, and I happen to have an identical horn in my spares collection, so I'll fit that. I'm pretty happy with everything around the front of the engine. I need to see how the radiator is going to fit. Unfortunately, it seems this radiator has been repaired before. This lower coolant inlet is off at a 90-degree angle. It's horizontal, when it should be almost vertical. This is going to make fitting the new coolant hoses almost impossible, so I've sent the radiator away to be repaired. I'll move on to other things in the meantime. I need to spend a little time fitting parts to the underside of the car, like this new main engine and gearbox earth strap, some brackets and braces, and the rear section of the prop shaft with some fresh bolts. I can finally now get around to fitting that rebuilt clutch mechanism. A couple of episodes back, I did some major work to the system. I replaced and set up all the clutch parts on the flywheel and in the bell housing, but now I can connect it to the pedal with the rebuilt lever arm and new cable. This may seem strange and unfamiliar to most of my viewers, as this is the right-hand drive version of the mechanical clutch system. The lever arm pivots on this post on the underside of the car, and then pulls a cable which is connected to the release bearing lever arm in the bell housing. There are a few weak points to this system, which means it can feel sloppy and become a pain to use, so it's best kept in top condition. Check out that older video for all the details on the clutch rebuild. But the condensed version is, this pivoting arm and the cable are prone to wearing to the point that it becomes almost unusable. This has a new main bushing, a new cable, and all new pins. Now it should have almost no play between the pedal and the release bearing. It's always important to make sure these rubber bellows are properly attached and working. Anything to keep water and dirt out of this cable is worth doing. I'm replacing the pin that connects the push rod to the pedal, as it was worn and causing a rattle. The new pin is much better. And the clutch feels good, if a little light. Although my ability to tell how heavy a clutch should be has been ruined by Porco's insanely heavy clutch, so any clutch feels light to me. The rear tower of the gearbox sticks up through the transmission tunnel, so it's easy to fit the gear lever and the vents and bushings that hold it in place. This is a good opportunity to set the shims and spacers for the gear lever, to make sure that the selection is accurate and the selector is properly lined up with the selector rods. When shifting from third to fourth, it should feel totally smooth. The bottom of the gear selector shouldn't be touching the selector shafts for first and second or reverse and fifth. Apart from that worn out bushing on the throttle pedal bracket, the rest of the throttle linkage was worn out too. And this car had the non-adjustable plastic main throttle rod. So I've replaced it with Classic Alfa's adjustable throttle rod assembly with new rod ends. Now the carburetors should be much easier to control. I got the radiator back from the shop. They corrected the lower coolant inlet, but they also replaced the top tank, as apparently it was leaking. The bonnet line of a Spider is really low, The nose of a spider is actually below the height of my knees when I stand next to one. That's why the radiator cap is off the side of the top tank and in the middle. There's just no space for it. This squared off top tank touches the underside of the bonnet. So I've marked out how much needs to be cut down and I've sent it back off to be modified. While that radiator was away, I decided to make an attempt at building a new battery box. This engine bay is very crowded, especially with a big universal alternator and the crossover air intake and filter. I've had to remove metal from the alternator to clear the air intake, and the horrible battery box that was in here didn't fit either, and it rather let the side down. So I've made a nice compact and adjustable battery box with a strap that's low and won't touch the underside of the bonnet. I can fit that alongside the radiator and everything fits. Finally, this engine bay will be free from rattles. And it looks pretty good. I'm quite happy with it. Now that everything is in place, I can get this ready for its first startup after months of work. I'm adding some fresh oil, a new oil filter element, and a fresh set of spark plugs. Before I install the plugs, I'm going to crank this engine over on the starter motor with no plugs, to get some oil circulating around the engine and to get some fuel up to the carburetors. I did rebuild the starter motor because it was a little weak, so hopefully this won't harm it too much. It's all freshly built and cleaned and greased. After a bit of cranking, I realized my fuel lines to the pump are on backwards, and so I switched those around. And after a little more cranking, I got fuel to the pressure regulator. So I installed the new spark plugs and connected the ignition coil, and it lives, finally. It sounds like an old aircraft or something. It's absolutely deafening. But at least I know it starts, and I'm happy. I feel like I can leave it here for this episode. It still needs an exhaust before I can tune it, so it's not quite ready for its first drive, but that will be next time. I hope. Maybe. Thank you for watching, and for watching all the way to the end. Before I let you go, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who supports me over on Patreon, and to the new patrons who've signed up since the last video, which was, I know, a terribly long time ago. Mr. Wendell, Don Salerno, A, John Barcash, Johannes Errett, Christian Quaid, Andrew Purcell, Jörg Staffelt, and Jean-Charles Roland. Thanks again for all the support, and I'll see you guys soon.